Everybody, and
good afternoon, Anne.
Good afternoon, Malcolm, and welcome to the April POGO call. As usual, this session is going to be recorded. Lee's just pressed record, so we are recording from now. Usual couple of bits of housekeeping, and then we'll get straight on. So there is still a little tiny bit of time to submit a paper proposal for the GoLab Social Outcomes Conference that closes on April the 30th. So get your skates on if you want to do that. And it's recently been announced that the keynote at that conference will be given by Professor Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winning economist. So that should be pretty cool. So even if you're not going to give a paper, I do hope that you'll join us for that event, which obviously goes beyond procurement into social outcomes more generally, but lots of interesting stuff going on, and it's always a really enjoyable few days. So today, what we're going to be focusing on is system level learning in procurement systems. And this is something that Rory and I started to think about a little bit just in response to the green paper and things like that, just beginning to think, well, you know, who's evaluating all of this stuff? Who knows if it works? And so our presentation today will be given by Nico Panagos, who's the head of the MAPS Secretariat in the OECD, MAPS standing for Methodology for Assessing Procurement Systems. So he's the man to tell us how to evaluate your procurement system and how to know whether it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say. And we have a star-studded panel who are going to comment on the presentation. So what I'm going to do now, without further ado, is hand over to Rory, who's going to set a little bit of context before we get into the presentation and the panel. And as always, there'll be some time at the end for your questions. So do please store those up. And we look forward to hearing as many of them as we possibly can later on. Rory, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so just very briefly from me, it's wonderful to have this session that's focused on system level learning. As Anne mentioned, it's happening in the context of some other things that are going on. I want to start by saying that, you know, as always here in the POGO Club, we're sort of broadly defining public procurement. So we're not focused just on the on like some kind of back office administrative function, but rather on the sort of overall strategy of how one spends billions through government contracts. And there are a couple of ways in which this, you know, matters at this time. One is in the context of building back better. So if the public contracts and public procurement system is going to be used to try and help stimulate economic recovery from COVID-19, then we should be thinking about this at a sort of strategic level. This comes into play with things like social value and new policies that are plugged into the procurement system that we expect will help create social value. So stepping back and thinking about this, you know, is important at this time. Another thing that is happening, of course, is you know, post-Brexit procurement reform. So as many in this group know, the UK government published a green paper on transforming public procurement. As a group, many of us put in a submission, and in that submission, we talked about things like transparency, but also sort of more broad things. So while that green paper sort of is described as legal reform, we also, Anne has pointed out that, you know, it more broadly is talking about transforming public procurement. So we thought that this was a good opportunity to bring in friends from the OECD's MAPS Secretariat to describe their way of thinking. They've come up with a framework. It's got 4 pillars. You can hear more about it, but it is a good opportunity to step back and think, okay, what in our overall procurement system, what's going on? How would we know this? Who should know this? And what do we do with that knowledge? So that's the context.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. So with that background, we can move straight on to Nico's presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for inviting me. I see many familiar faces, so that's good. We will have a good discussion, and I guess many of you might have seen at least part of this, what I'm going to show, but just to get us started on what the maps is, why it is useful, and especially in that context that Rory was talking about right now as we are trying to build back better, and why it is important to understand where we are and what's going on well and what's not with a procurement system. So I guess general numbers, these are about to be updated in a couple of months with a new government at a glance from the OECD on the weight of procurement within GDP in several nations, but yeah, roughly between 6 and 20% from these numbers. And I guess most of you will, of course, know, and it's not something that we have to dive in deep into about why procurement matters right now, and also why procurement matters not only from the academic, government, and supplier perspective, but also citizens are now asking specific things from the procurement system to really receive the goods and services that they need from governments. So this is the context of where MAPS stands, the methodology for assessing procurement systems, which is really a tool that is universal and is meant as a reform tool. It's universal in the sense that it can be used in any procurement system at any level. So it can be used for a national government, for a subnational government, and regardless of the level of development. That was not the case with the previous maps. The previous maps was mostly used for developing economies. Afterwards, between 2015 and 2018, there was a revision process that came up with a new methodology that can be applied anywhere and has been applied in many different contexts and a range of different countries throughout the world. It's a reform tool because the objective of MAPS is really to diagnose a procurement system to understand where can it improve and how it can improve, both on the effectiveness and efficiency of procurement, but also ensuring those very basic things that we need: integrity, transparency, and the use of public funds. All of this, both from the reform point of view, but also when you're carrying out the assessment, guaranteeing that there are multiple stakeholders dialoguing with government and with the decision makers about how procurement can be better. An assessment is done through objective indicators. I will go deeper into that in a minute. Engages several stakeholders, so it's not only speaking with government, but with all the stakeholders that make up a procurement system in a country. And also puts an emphasis, this new revised methodology, on guaranteeing a quality standard that really, when you read a MAPS assessment, you know that it's followed all the steps of the process and the indicators that have been designed. And it goes in general, but I would say with a general aspect that you would imagine that you have to assess for a procurement system to be considered well functioning. So one related to value for money, and on the very well, traditional perspective, I would say, of it being economic, effective, efficient, and also sustainable. The second point on transparency, both from the legal and institutional framework, but also how this is really working if people are able to use information that is produced by the public procurement system in a way that's timely, in a way that's comprehensible, and in a way that's really accessible for their own use and analysis. Fairness, also providing a level playing field for all suppliers, ensuring equal treatment, and ensuring also that decisions are taken accordingly and also disclosed accordingly, ensuring integrity. and good governance of the whole system. Good governance institutionally, but also understanding how reforms can be put forward in a certain procurement system. And this is all put together into a methodology that has 4 pillars. 4 pillars that were designed, and that was also taken from the initial methodology, designed to understand the various aspects of a procurement system. So the first one deals with a legal, regulatory, and policy framework. So all the rules that are set up in a system to function, and for each one of those, as you see, there are indicators and sub-indicators. So the role of the assessor is to understand for each one of those whether they are met, and they are actually, when you go and read the methodology, they are put in as an aspiration. So if a country complies with something that is seen as a best practice, and if not, if there are gaps, how important are those gaps, and how could a country do something or create a strategy to bridge those gaps. Second pillar is on the institutional framework and management capacity of the staff dealing with procurement. So it also entails understanding how institutions, be it the institution that deals with regulation, the institution that may be in a country dealing with framework agreements or with centralized purchasing, and also the procuring entities themselves, how they are working together, and how this is set up in a way that is within, that works well within the budget and financial management system of a country. Number 3, procurement operations and market practices. Procurement operations dealing with, and actually for assessing this pillar, the assessors should carry out a sampling of procurement processes to understand really, in reality, whether for the process and for each stage of the process, starting from planning to contract management, whether there are steps taken to guarantee specific, well, for example, equal treatment of suppliers, that decisions are disclosed, and that really market practices are kept on along with the best practice. And also how the suppliers are engaging with a public procurement system, if they are really capable of supplying the goods and services that the country needs, and how they enter into a dialogue, not only for selling, but also for reforming the procurement system. And finally, pillar number 4 deals with accountability, integrity, and transparency. So all the measures that are put in place for anti-corruption, against fraud and other prohibited practices. Also how civil society engages with public procurement and how they are able to complement also, as we were speaking about this dialogue with the private sector, how they are also able or not to come into a dialogue with our government about how to reform procurement, how to understand what the government is buying. And this pillar also deals with audit, how auditors are able to really go deep into procurement and understand what's going on. All this with the context provided from a country context analysis, the quality assurance that I will let you know in a bit, and also supplementary modules that were designed to be 6 and are designed to be 6. Right now, live, we already have professionalization and sustainable procurement, which can be used as said in any country. The idea is to do a core maps, and then continue to do one of those or several of those if a country wants to go deeper into one of those. And for the others, sector level, PPPs, entity level, those are already finalized, and we hope this year to carry out pilots or to support partners carry out pilots with countries to test those supplementary modules and have them finalized and live for any country to use. And for e-procurement, this is still being finalized with the partners. So again, we hope to finalize that this year and then carry out the piloting in any country. Maps is a tool that can be used by anyone. So it's let's say it's an open methodology. The methodology, you can access it on our website, mapsinitiative.org. If a country wants to receive the map seal of approval, so have the assessment follow the complete quality assurance process and be published at the end on the website, it's important for the country to follow the complete methodology, which includes going at several points through the MAP Secretariat and through a technical advisory group for the assessment. And I said it can be done by any country, and it can be done even as a self-assessment, although it's not the case usually. Usually the case for a partner, a multilateral development bank, or a bilateral donor to provide support to a country to carry out the assessment. So these have been carried out throughout the world, or have been planned right now, either at a subnational or national level. There you see that even on a wide range of contexts. Norway carried out the core maps and the sustainable procurement module. Several in Africa, Latin America, and Asia being carried out right now. Greece, Moldova. So really, we see a wide range being used, and even ongoing assessment right now, being the methodology being used across the world. So the main milestone for an assessment, once a country agrees to carry out an assessment, is preparing what we call a concept note. That concept note goes through the Secretariat, and the Secretariat also assembles with a group of experts, this technical advisory group, to provide comments to the assessment. The assessors then carry out the country context analysis, the assessment itself for each one of those indicators and sub-indicators, and validate the findings with in-country stakeholders. Afterwards, the draft report goes through a quality assurance process with the MAP Secretariat undertaking the part of the methodology, so seeing if the methodology was complied with, and the technical advisory group giving more substantial comments on the report to finally publish the report. And of course, the follow-up of the recommendations and of the implementation of these recommendations is carried out by the country with the help of the lead institutions, for example, the banks. Yes, some good practices for the assessments on clearly defining objectives involving many stakeholders which are involved in procurement. Identifying these strengths and weaknesses to really develop actionable recommendations and following up on the assessment results. And finally, just briefly, a note on the Secretariat that it's really, the Secretariat is housed within the OECD. It's an independent institution within the OECD. It has a steering committee of several partners, and also relies on a MAPS network. Those were the institutions and the countries that really pushed forward this revision process of the maps and came up with a new maps. And the MAP Secretariat is here to support users on these milestones that I told you about, the quality assurance, solving questions about the maps, and really promoting use for any country to understand what is assessment, what is its procurement system is looking like. So just some contact points there, and yeah, I'm happy to discuss anything with you on how this can be used, and especially right now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nika, very much indeed for the presentation, also for impressive timekeeping, which is an example to us all. We've got a panel lined up to discuss this, and then we'll come back to you for further comments towards the end of that before we move on to questions. And first up on the panel is Abby Semple from Procurement Analysis. Abby.
Okay, thanks, Anne, and thanks, Nicola, for presenting the tool. I sort of come across maps previously, but I'd never had a chance to really look at it in detail. So it's really good to get some of the detail behind it. And I think, you know, from what you've shown us, it seems like an excellent tool and one that could really help in terms of trying to think clearly about, you know, what are the objectives of a procurement system? How do we measure it? How do we assess it? How do we make it better? It's quite systematic in that respect. And I think one of the critiques that we've heard of you know, the Green Paper consultation in the UK was that we're really coming with a very you know, a lot of preconceptions and a lot of prejudices, you know, regardless of who we are, to that process. And it's very difficult to sort of take a step back and think clearly about, okay, well, what is actually the objective of procurement regulation? How does that relate to other things that impact what we do in terms of procurement, whether they're legal or otherwise? So quite good to have that as a resource. I guess the main question from my perspective would be who is capable, who is qualified to complete this on behalf of a jurisdiction? You know, I'm thinking about Ireland, where I do a lot of my work, which is a very small jurisdiction and which has a relatively centralized public procurement function. But even there, I would really struggle to think of somebody who is capable of doing this. You know, so maybe it needs to be a team. I don't know if that's a question you address in your guidance. And I guess that points to another issue that comes up to me a lot when we start to think about procurement as a policy tool, sort of strategic procurement, or however you want to refer to it, which is that even in countries with a relatively centralized procurement function, it is a highly dispersed activity. So we know that, for example, across Europe, we have hundreds of thousands of contracting authorities and hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of individuals involved in public procurement. So trying to implement any policy through procurement has that challenge of, you know, there's so many different people involved. The nature of procurement is so diverse. So, you know, it's an extremely different activity depending on whether you're talking about buying standardized supplies or purchasing highly complex social services. So again, I'd be interested in both how you target the tool in terms of who can fill it out and how you sort of aim to cover those very disparate aspects of procurement.
Sure. So should I take that already? And then I see also Paulo raising his hand. So maybe.
Go on. I think since those are very specific questions, why don't you take those now, and then we'll move on to the rest of the panel.
Sure. So maybe on your first question, who does this? So that gives me the opportunity to speak about two things. So for the assessments, it's important to have a steering committee of the assessment. So in general, it would be the main procuring agency of a like regulatory function, along with, of course, Ministry of Finance, audit institutions. So it's really coming up with the whole set of institutions within the government that would be able to speak about procurement and speak about reform. But of course, when you think about the assessment, this is in general done, as you say, as a team. So it's important to understand that the consultants or the assessors need to be qualified, and that's part of the work that we are trying to build at the MAP Secretariat on providing guidance, but also at some point on certifying those assessors, of being able to really determine if the people that are going to carry out the assessment have the experience and also the knowledge of the maps to carry out the assessment. So that's on your point. And on the second one, yeah, I mean, it's not only on, as you were saying, of course, the complexity, for example, in Europe, of different and different countries be using different systems, federal, centralized. So that also poses like additional issues when you think about carrying out a MAPS assessment. So how we've seen this is again trying to focus and determining the scope, whether for a country or going deep into, for example, a state. I think that's the main point. And also during the assessment, trying to have a wide range of stakeholders during the assessment, but also for validation, to validate against, for example, a number of procurement officers from different levels within the organization, but also different organizations within the government, so that you can really take a good view of what's happening with a procurement system.
Okay.
Fantastic, thank you. I think one of your OECD colleagues is here with a raised hand. Paolo, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Anne, and it's good to be back to the POGO. I see that the audience enlarged over the last few calls. That's very good. And I see some very good friends, Chris Eukins and Gianluigi Albano and others. It's good to be connected again. I just wanted maybe to highlight and complement a bit what Nicolas just said. In fact, the MAP Secretariat is hosted by the OECD, but the OECD itself is carrying MAPS assessments. And I just wanted to bring you the experience we had with Norway, where we conducted an assessment of both the core methodology that Norway used to the white paper. They produced a white paper to the parliament. Every 10 years, they do this assessment of the policy areas. And they wanted to submit the white paper to the parliament, and they used the maps as a tool, a structured assessment tool, to inform them about the challenges they were facing. And even in advanced and developed countries such as Norway, we identified several challenges within their procurement system. So it was a useful tool for them to provide the policymakers with concrete evidence on what could be improved there. And last year, we finalized the Sustainable Public Procurement module in Norway again, using the module that is now available for the maps. And they used it to also to develop the strategy for green and innovation in Norway. So the maps is forward-looking, very ambitious tool. And even if you apply it to well-advanced OECD economies, you will always find areas that require improvement. We applied it in many other countries, small states in the Caribbean, Kazakhstan. We are now doing a MAPS assessment in Greece. So I would say in Ireland, you mentioned, Abby, it's possible to work with OGP and come up with a very thorough assessment of public procurement in Ireland. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed for that insight. I'm going to go back to the panel now. And next up is Mark Rodden, who's head of procurement at North Somerset and South. I can't say it, South Gloucestershire Councils. I know where it is, I just can't say it. Mark, over to you for a perspective from practice, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. It's been a long day, isn't it? And so, and thank you, Nico, for the overview. Yeah, it seems like a really thorough, detailed tool that you developed here. But for me, it focuses really well on the processes, on the governance, on the ways of working, on that sort of interaction across the system. The bit that is a bit of a hobby horse of mine that I can't see is around the capability of the people that are working within that system, though. The capability of the basic procurement professional who is undertaking these activities. I'm very old and I've been working for many years. In the 90s, I think we used to call it benchmarking, and benchmarking had all of the things that you were including, but it also had something around, how good and how skilled are the people that are working in this system. So, for instance, there's things like evaluation. You can evaluate a system and say, how are you going about developing suitable evaluation criteria? But what are the skills of the procurement professional to know what the right things are to evaluate and what questions to ask of suppliers? You talked about market practices, but again, there's something there for me about the skills of a procurement professional to sort of understand what the market is telling them, and to sort of interpret that and work out how it impacts your procurement strategy. Risk, again, another one of my hobby horses. I think in any sort of process like this, you can be shown some very impressive sort of risk registers and procedures and stuff, but the procurement professional needs to understand what those risks mean, and most importantly, where to actually mitigate them in a procurement process. So I just want to, that might be not what you're about with this. You may say, well, that's sort of a different aspect of this that comes along separately. But I'd be just wondered interested in your views really as to, because as you said, this is about guaranteeing a quality standard. For me, I'm not sure how you can guarantee a quality standard, because it's still all about the people. It's still all about, for me, identifying what people work within the system and what their skills and capabilities are. So do you have a view on that?
Nico, do you want to respond to that now? You're very welcome to do so.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think you're touching upon a very interesting topic, because the maps indeed has an indicator about the capacity of the procurement staff, but more in terms of understanding whether there are systems in place that guarantee training, that guarantee capacity building, that provide assistance and advice to the procurement staff, and even going deeper into if procurement is considered a profession. And again, you could even go deeper into carrying out the supplementary module on professionalization. So that's one point. I think the one thing that the assessment does not do is really assess. So it does not. It is not intended to kind of to test a sample, for example, of procurement officers on specific questions and test their knowledge of those. That could possibly, you could think of a limitation, but of course it's not intended to, it wasn't thought to go in that direction, but more if the system puts in place the necessary to provide training, to provide assistance, to really develop the officers as professionals in procurement.
Okay, thank you.
Fantastic, thank you very much indeed. And last but not least on our panel, Chris Eukins, who needs no introduction, professor at George Washington, and in front, as always, of a very impressive bookcase. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Anne. If you knew how many stakeholders I have to mollify, that's why I have this neutral background, including my wife. So as Nico knows, we're actually working on a MAPS assessment for for Pacific Island nation. I'm doing it pro bono with the Commercial Law Development Program in Commerce, because this particular Pacific Island nation is strategically important for the United States. So the United States wants to help build capacity there to, in order to, as part of the soft power of the United States, which I get involved in these things, and I don't fully understand that, but I'm working on the procurement aspects of it. Anyway, so when Nico and I talked to the folks at the Commerce Department, we had a discussion about whether or not it's possible for a user of maps to feed back into the map system saying, oh, you know, you really should improve this aspect of the map system. And Nico said, no, it's not possible. And Nico, I have to say that since we talked, I engaged with a very important stakeholder. It's the minister in this island nation who's in charge of deciding whether or not to go forward with the public maps or a private maps. And he's terrified about public maps because he's terrified that it'll turn up corruption. So he wants to do a private maps first. So we're going to go through a whole process of doing a private maps assessment first. And then if it's politically acceptable, do a public maps assessment after that. What I learned from that, Nico, is that if you even open the door to communication from users, you don't have to accept their suggestions, but have the door open to communications like, oh, by the way, in our country, we allow the deputy prime minister to review all procurement awards. That's clearly a violation of many norms that we're aware of. But if the politicians in a given country can say, I've told the OECD it's a bad idea to say that it's a bad idea that we allow the deputy prime minister. If you allow the politicians to feed back and say, and defend their position, it makes it more palatable for them to engage in the MAPS process. You don't have to accept their suggestions. If you just, it's like when we do student evaluations. We let our students evaluate us all the time. We don't actually read them. We let them evaluate all the time. It's a release, sorry, Rory. It's a release. It's a release valve to think about. The other thing is that it's a dialogue. The MAPS assessment is a dialogue, much like the UNCAC review process, which is really a powerful vehicle for reform, particularly in very corrupt countries. Knowing that there's going to be a UN Convention Against Corruption review coming up enables the reformers to demand reform. I went through this in Myanmar before this genuinely dark time. The reformers were using the UNCAC review, the UN Convention Against Corruption, as a means of pressing for reform and procurement. And you might want to think about how the MAPS process could institutionalize that kind of cross-national discussion so that reformers in a given country with a MAPS review underway would be able to leverage sister nations review, sort of peer shaming as a way of moving forward. I found only one YouTube video of you, Nico. It's great, but it's 1 hour and 16 minutes. You're a very good looking guy. Leverage it. Get out there. And you could do a short YouTube video with maybe voiceover PowerPoint, so that users, because we have a really hard time explaining to potential users what MAPS is, and having you explain, giving a briefing just like you did, doing it on YouTube would be very, very useful. The last thing is norms, and it's a hard question. So what I do, Nico, is I'm an American, and I go into any given situation, and people have preconceptions about what American is. I can't ratchet that back to nothing. So what I do is I throw out a lot of norms at the same time. I talk about defense. I talk about the need for sustainability. I throw out a lot of norms to basically to confuse the audience so they can't pigeonhole me. You have a salient norm here in this framework. It's the fairness norm, which I don't disagree with, even for instrumental reasons. But if you have just one salient norm, that can be off-putting to some people who don't really believe in fairness. There's a lot of your stakeholders out there who, I'm from Massachusetts, trust me, they're plenty corrupt. You want to be able, I would throw out a number of different norms simultaneously. Anytime you put a norm out there, put multiple norms so that they can't pigeonhole you. If that makes sense. And I'm sorry not to ask questions, but to be more prescriptive, but I'm in the middle of this process. I thought it might be useful.
Thank you very much for those reflections, Chris. Nico, do you want to come back on any of that?
Sure. Let me see. So on the improvements, and I don't know if I didn't make myself clear on that one. So we are indeed open to hearing how MAPS is being applied and any possible improvement. So what I said is maybe on the timing of the process that we don't envisage a modification of the core MAPS in the short term. So what we would want is the core MAPS to be applied in more countries, to countries continue to provide for leading institutions to provide support to countries, for more reports to come up, more reports to get published. But of course, afterwards, we would for sure, if there's anything, not only on things that can be corrected right now, but I think this also needs to be, as with our revision process, the methodology needs to be up to date to anything that comes up, either technological, new advances and market practices, anything. So really, we need to think about providing that both with the core and with the supplementary modules. So I'd be very glad to hear of any feedback and things that can be improved. You mentioned about the whole process, and we also mentioned that in the call, because and that's also important. So the methodology, as I told you, is available for anyone to see. And during the call, we discussed a lot about using parts of the methodology. So there was this concept of, for example, understanding only the legal or the policy framework, so applying Pillar 1. But my view on that was really that it's important to try to push countries, if they are undertaking the MAPS assessment, to really carry out the whole process, the whole structure with the pillars, because it's the only way that you can really understand how procurement is being done. So maybe many times you can see something that could be well in the law, but does not get applied, or there are no institutions that can apply those laws. Well, many things can happen, and really it's important to see all of those aspects. And on the other way around too. So for reformers that are only focusing on legal reforms, I think even some reforms can be carried out through legal reforms that have to do with either anti-corruption or market practices. So it's really important to see all of the pillars. On the peer shaming, also that gives me the opportunity to talk about something that was discussed during the revision process of this methodology does not work as other similar methodologies, I would say, that deal with a public financial management system of a country, in terms of not grading or not providing a score for a country. And that was done on purpose to really focus on the gaps and the actions, and not necessarily on saying this country is doing better than the other. Again, with pros and cons. Peer shaming might be useful to push forward some things, but this was meant really to get a snapshot of what you're looking at and provide some actionable recommendation. And good points on the fairness. I take note of that, and on the YouTube. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got a hand raised from Rory to kick off the discussion. If anyone else has got questions, comments, thoughts, please raise an electronic hand or put something in the chat. You can also try waving at me, but that's probably not the most effective way to get my attention. Rory.
Hi, so I had a question actually for Chris. So if we're talking about this in the context of things like building back better, and things like the post-Brexit public procurement reform transfer in the UK, transforming public procurement. And the idea is that this is one methodology to step back and think about all the different pillars involved. I wanted to ask Chris for his reflections on within the US system and the United States federal system, sort of whose job is it to sort of sit back and think about, is this procurement system working? You know, how is that, you know, if that knowledge is sort of surfaced, how is, you know, who has access to that knowledge? What then happens with it? It was interesting to me that Nico pointed out that Norway sort of does an assessment like this every 10 years, and then that goes to the parliament there. And so, you know, is there anything that the US does that we should be thinking about when thinking about our, you know, learning, system level learning in a public procurement system?
The US may be a particularly bad example, Rory, because we're so arrogant. So the answer to your question, who actually reviews our system on an ongoing basis, is me. What do we do with it? We dump it on our poor students, you. There's no mechanism in the United States for doing this type of review, and it would be met with extreme xenophobia if we did it. If we would literally spend, I could literally spend days explaining to people that Paulo is in fact not actually French, even though he's in Paris. It's okay, he's Portuguese. It would be,
yeah, but I would observe that you do have systems like, there isn't a survey of procurement professionals done, for example. There is a committee with it, a subcommittee, you know, over on the House that's responsible for you know, public procurement within the Committee for Oversight and Government Reform, and you know, and something similar on the Senate. There are systems there for learning about, well, how is our federal procurement system going?
So this actually traces back to what Abby was saying, and to put kidding aside for 1 second. So I think the secret is to use maps, that everybody on this call needs to be trained in using maps and needs to use maps, whether or not it's in a local government or a foreign government, needs to be trained to use maps as a way of thinking about a system. And then the people on this call can then serve. It's much more effective for the United States or the UK to say, hey, the Brits are doing this in the green paper, or the Americans think we should do this from under the green paper, to do that cross analysis, that piercing cross analysis, but informed by what each of us has learned from maps, so that once we become an expert in this holistic approach to procurement system, we become a much more effective comparative critic and a way of pushing, a person who can push change. So it's really about building capacity in individual people in the community. That's the secret gift that Nico and Paulo are giving us.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got Malcolm next, and then Abby.
Thanks very much, Anne. Well, Rory gave me an interesting feed-in, because I wanted to ask particularly about a question raised by Abby about the broader objectives of a procurement system. As you know, I'm particularly keen about innovation in public procurement, and also how it's going to be used to deliver sustainability responses involving innovative companies, and in some cases also using procurement as a tool to help develop those innovative companies. Now, these are all collateral issues. I mean, clearly, the MAPS process doesn't necessarily focus on those, So the question I wanted to ask our OECD colleagues in particular is that, given that they have a really strong track record on looking at innovation policy and innovative solutions, I mean, have a look. I invite you, those of you who haven't have seen the Observatory for Public Sector Innovation in OECD. I mean, how far are you thinking about the evolution of this to actually look at some of those innovation policy driven solutions? And my second point, actually, because I'm fascinated about Norway, and I would very much like to see, which is clearly a public, the Norway report. If you want to look at benchmarking data country by country, the European Commission has that data. I mean, we have reports on a country by country basis for the performance of the public procurement system. But really interestingly, the only study that's been done about innovation in public procurement on a comparative basis has been done by the European Commission. For those of you that are interested, the final results were only published, I think, last week on their website. But Norway came out as top of that. And we're very interested. So I can just, if I can close, Anne, by making what I hope you'll feel is a good announcement, is that Connected Places Catapult, who I'm an associate with, together with the University of Manchester, University of Birmingham team, have formally launched our Consortium for Research in Innovative and Strategic Public Procurement, which shortens to CRISP with a P, double P at the end. And I'm hoping that we will be doing some benchmarking work and collecting more data about how the innovative process works, drawing on some of the work that the European Union has done.
Fantastic, thanks. Nico, do you want to, or Paolo, do you want to come in on those questions?
So I'll just briefly mention something and let Paolo speak about that general OECD view. It's on the maps. I think most of these topics are treated, especially within the sustainability view, and as such within the core maps, but also especially within the sustainable procurement supplementary module. Everything dealing with innovation towards with a view of sustainability. But yeah, Paolo, I think you can speak a bit more about the OECD general work on these topics.
Thanks, and thanks for the question, Malcolm. Yes, indeed, the OPSI, the observatory, includes practices on innovation in all domains of public administration, not just procurement-related ones. And for the COVID-19 work, we did collect several practices for procurement, and they are there as well. And with them, we are trying to explore how to bring more evidence and more good practices related to public procurement and also infrastructure governance, which is a topic that is under our belt right now. For Norway, maybe an interesting angle, if I may share this with you. When we went there to discuss the scope of the work on sustainable procurement, they were only interested in the green dimension of sustainability. So of the three dimensions of sustainability, the economical, the social, and the environmental one, they were just focusing on the green. And we told them, you need to look at sustainability at large, broader concept. Yeah. And that's why they started to look at innovation. And in the end, they accepted our views. And that's why they expanded a bit the action plan and the strategy to look at innovation. So even a country such as Norway, sometimes it's useful to get these external views and these, let's say, neutral approaches that would allow them
very good,
to come out of their comfort zone. Because if you look at the procurement system there, they only capture indicators on green, and they only have requirements in the legal framework. 30% of the procurement should have green objectives. And now they are looking beyond it. They are going a bit into innovation and how to include sustainability, how to look at labor rights and human rights in terms of, the workers that are doing construction. So this kind of work comes after an assessment. That's why I think the maps is a useful tool to
definitely
to take you out of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Abby.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just interested in whether we think doing this kind of sober, neutral systems level assessment is easier or harder for public procurement than it is for other areas of public sector activity. So I'm thinking of something like taxation. And I don't know whether that's an area where the OECD has tools or anyone else has experience doing systems level assessments. But the reason I ask is it seems to me that as procurement has become more broadly understood as a strategic rather than administrative activity, you have fewer and fewer neutral bystanders. And so, you know, Chris mentioned, obviously, in every country, there are people who have a vested interest in procurement, whether for good reasons or bad reasons. But it just seems that most people who sort of understand procurement or have an overview of it also have very strong opinions on it. So I'm just interested in as to whether that's a unique feature of procurement, or is that something that you find in other areas when you try and do this type of assessment?
It's a fascinating question, Nico.
Yeah, well, what I can say is that I've seen, let's say, a similar approach in other areas, especially as you say, for example, tax. When you think about the public financial management system, the usual evaluations that are done are TADAT and PIFA. So both of those, I would say, have similarities with maps. They are different in the way that I was explaining. Maps does not score, but they are built also in the sense of having some indicators that were agreed upon at some point in time by the creators of the methodology, and that then are applied to different countries, regardless of, of their context, in the sense that all the indicators can be applied to specific countries. But I guess also you have a point on more on the theoretical aspect. Yeah, I would be curious actually to hear from others what you might think, if procurement is really something completely different to other parts of the public financial management system. Myself, I would say that that these, as said, these are other parts could resemble procurement in the sense of being cross-cutting, of being used at different levels. I guess with regards to procurement, it's really the fact that many people, even within government, don't understand, and especially in many places at the high end of the pyramid, why this matters. I think that's because when you speak about tax and revenues, I think that's usually people understand that, but I think that would be maybe the key point I would highlight.
Thanks. There's a great question in the chat from Patrick. Patrick, do you want to flesh out your question?
Oh, hi, and thank you for having me here. As I am a practitioner, I'm quite curious how maps can help me make my management understand what procurement is about and what the risks are of having a difficult or failing procurement policy, if there is a policy at all, because the problem I have is convincing my management that procurement matters and can make a difference. So if the tool is practical and can point out some advantages for my management, I can get them to think about management actually of procurement, and not saying I'm hungry, buy me foods, until they get angry because it takes too long.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think like my piece of advice really would be to see one of the reports that are public, for example, as you were saying, about the Norway report, and how really this provides a diagnosis of what's happening, but also key recommendations that can be translated actually to what procurement staff are doing. So it not only, and also what the methodology strives for is to create an action plan with different levels of priorities of how these can be implemented. So it can be, I mean, it can be anything from you have to amend the law, but it can also be on simple or simpler market practices that can be changed, or simpler guidance that can be done, or a manual that can be put forward to the procurement staff. And I think this is really the value there. I would say that when you see the recommendations, possibly it's not and of course it doesn't go to the level of I would say specific guidance for procurement staff themselves when you read the report, or more on reforming things that can afterwards help them do their job better. Yeah, I hope that some.
Can I add another question?
Sure.
To your answer? So
yeah, please do.
So the tips I can find in the report and the methodology itself, does it steer to how to safely procure and be efficient, or does it steer to how to efficiently procure and be safe? If you catch the nuances.
So I would say first point, the methodology, the indicators are provided as an aspiration, so a best practice towards something. And it provides a best practice towards what I briefly pointed out there about, I would say in general, for example, value for money. So in general, comprising efficiency and effectiveness. And it deals with those safeguards, let's say, for pillar 4. So actually, you should see this as something holistic, but I would say it's more focused on the former, how to really provide what you need to buy with a good cost, with a good timing. But of course, the controls of the system, the audit, are dealt with also, but in a way such as not to, I would say, interfere with the main objective of procurement. So important to, of course, take these into account, but dealt with in a specific pillar, that's pillar 4.
Thank you.
Paolo, I can see you'd like to come in.
Yes, if I may just quickly provide a couple of comments to Patrick. You know, the pillar 3 is looking at procurement practices. So for this pillar, we usually look at a sample of concrete procurements. We look at the way they were done. We have a sample methodology and to extract information about the different phases from the planning until the execution. So it's possible to capture the failures in concrete procurements. It took us 3 years to develop the maps, you know, from 15 to 18. So it's a lot of thinking around the maps, the core maps. That's why Nico doesn't want to change it so quickly, so soon. But it's also, on top of that, we have a module that is looking at the entity level. And this entity level is looking at the practices of a concrete entity, right? A contracting authority, a CPB, and so on. So it's possible to go deeper into the practices of the organization and then try to fix the things that are not working properly. And just to finalize, in Kazakhstan, we did apply the core methodology to the sovereign fund. They have a large wealth sovereign fund that is in fact 3 times bigger than the national procurement system, with more than 200 companies as part of the fund. And we looked at the procurement practices of the fund. And if you look at the report, we provide concrete action points and recommendations for them to improve the procurement of the fund. So I think it's possible, yes.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. So I think in view of the time, I should probably draw this to a close. Thank you very much indeed to Nico and also to Paolo for the presentation and for the insights from the OECD. Thank you also to our other speakers and panelists, so Rory, Abby, Mark and Chris. Your comments all much appreciated. Thank you to the rest of you for your questions and thoughts. I think it's been a great discussion. There's lots more to think about with this kind of evaluation. So thank you everyone for your contributions. do please get in touch with me or Lee or Rory if you've got any suggestions for anything that you'd like to see covered on a future call. If you've got work of your own that you'd like to present, or if you've got suggestions for topics that you would enjoy hearing more about. Obviously, we want these sessions to be interesting and useful to you. So do please let us know if there's anything that you would find particularly enjoyable, and we'll see what we can do. So thank you, everyone, and hopefully we will see you in May. Wow, May already. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Anne.
Thank you.
Thank you.